In my last video, we touched on Dr. Krashen's second language acquisition theory. In a nutshell, he believes that we human beings don't learn languages. We pick them up naturally. We acquire them. But for this natural acquisition to happen, we must first expose ourselves to comprehensible inputs. That is, we always have to understand the messages behind in order to acquire the language, to acquire the linguistic forms. Now, in today's talk, not only will I break his theory down for you and walk you through Dr. Krashen's every hypothesis, but also I will show you their implications and how we can take them and revolutionize the way we acquire any languages. So, prepare to be amazed. Well, if you're still wondering what exactly comprehensible input is, then let's first see what incomprehensible input looks like.
A bez vody odbehol ďalší maratón v Namíbijskej púšti.
Aby toho nebolo málo, neuveriteľných 112 minút vydržal v nádobe plnej ľadu.
Holandský motivátor a kaskadér Wim Hof je na Slovensku.
Well, what do you think? I'll be very surprised if you have understood anything, except that these two are simply gorgeous. Now, let's take a listen to this mini lecture in German. See how much you can understand.
Das ist Mr. Spock, ja? Mr. Spock hat zwei Ohren. Ohren. Verstehen Sie? Ohren? Er hat zwei Ohren. Okay, Mr. Spock. Ja? Ach, nein. Entschuldigung. Okay. Augen. Verstehen Sie? Augen? Augen. Wie viele Augen? 1, 2, 3 Augen. 3 Augen. Ist das richtig? 3 Augen? Nein. Wir haben nur 2 Augen. Mund. Verstehen Sie Mund? Und hier ist eine Zigarette, ja? Nein. Zigaretten sind nicht gut.
Well, of course, you didn't understand every word of it, but more or less, you got the gist of it. You could take a very good guess about what's going on, and that's the whole point. That's what we call comprehensible input. And now, with that definition sorted, I think we're ready to dive in the 5 core hypotheses in Dr. Krashen's theory. But before that, I'd like to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Boya. I'm using their latest wireless microphone solution, Boya XM6. It's got a very compact and trendy design, phenomenal audio quality, an operating range up to 100 meters, and of course, a very user-friendly interface. With just a click of button, you're all set. Of course, you charge through this Type-C port, and when it's done, it can give you a runtime up to 7 hours, which is impressive. So, if you're also looking for a wireless microphone solution, then I'd say this Boya XM6 gives you the best value for money in its segment. Well, actually, I think we have already covered the first 2 hypotheses in my last video. First up, we have this acquisition learning hypothesis. You see, if we want to develop our ability in a language, we either learn it or we acquire it. But learning is a very conscious process. We know what we're learning, and we're working very hard towards it, just like what we did back in schools. Acquisition, however, is wholly different. It's the product of a subconscious process. We think we are watching a video, like what we were doing right now, or we are reading a comic book. Of course, we're doing these things, but in the meantime, we are acquiring the language. So we are not aware of it when it happens. It requires no energy, no effort, nothing. Just that all that is necessary is for you to understand the message. That brings us to the second hypothesis, comprehension hypothesis.
We acquire language when we understand messages. When people speak to us in another language and we understand what they say, or we read something in another language and we understand the message, language acquisition will take place.
More specifically, if we understand messages that contain certain aspects of the language that we haven't yet acquired but are ready to acquire, then we can acquire this bit of new knowledge. Let's say your current level is at I for input. And if you expose yourself to comprehensible input at I+1 level, it's not I+10, it's not I+100, just something slightly above your current level, then if you can understand the meaning behind first, you will stand a chance to acquire the forms, the linguistic structures by which the I+1 is expressed. Take that mini lecture in German as an example. It's very simple. of course, your current level in German, for most of you, is at nearly 0. But it's very simple, so just slightly above your level. And of course, with the help of your knowledge of the words, with the help of more importantly, the context, you can understand more or less everything. And when you understand it, you can pick up lots of things. And let's not forget, you do have your knowledge in English to fall back on. Because you see, the pronunciation of cigarette for the word 3, for Mr. Spock, are very similar to those in English. So you can understand everything. And then you can gradually acquire it. Speaking of I+1, it's related to the third hypothesis. Now, the remaining 3 hypotheses are even more interesting than the previous 2. Let's start with this natural order hypothesis. You see, Dr. Krashen and his school of thought believe that we all acquire languages, especially grammatical items, in a specific order. Some grammatical items are acquired very early on, while others are acquired later. Now, take English as an example. The ing thing, the progressive marker, is always among the first items to be acquired. Meanwhile, other seemingly simple rules, just as simple as that ing thing, is always acquired later.
Because there's a lot of stuff that we hear that we're not going to acquire for another 2 years. Take, for example, English. Certain grammatical items are there all the time, and they're very late acquired. Like the third person singular ending, he goes. That can take 6 months to a year for children, first language. Second language, sometimes it doesn't come, ever. Some dialects don't have it. And a beginner is going to hear that all the time. You can ignore it. Wait till its time has come.
Well, like I said in my last video, your grammatical accuracy will only come in time. It will only come when you are ready. But somehow, some teachers seem to think that they can change the natural order by providing you with lots of explanations, drills, exercises, and so on. I mean, a teacher can drill the third person singular for a month without making any progress on the student's speaking ability because the students are not ready. I mean, they can do very well in the test, but if they want to speak, they have to apply those consciously learned rules on the spot. They're not fluent. They're not going to use them. Even if they know the rules very well, they hear the third person singular every day, they're not ready. And the next hypothesis is all about rules. The monitor hypothesis. According to Dr. Krashen, those consciously learned knowledge, grammar, that sort of things, at best can serve as monitors or editors for your output. Let's say you're writing a speech or an article. You don't want to embarrass yourself by making lots of mistakes, especially if you have to read them out loud later. You don't want to make any mistakes. And that's when grammar comes in very handy. But in your daily conversation, it's extremely hard to monitor yourself because 3 very stringent conditions must be met for you to do that. First, you must know the rules, of course. And second, you must be able to think about correctness all the time while you are producing the output. It's not very easy for some people because you have to think about what you're saying and how you're saying it at the same time. It's like multitasking, like simultaneous interpreting. And thirdly, you must have ample time. Let's say your friend asks you, where is Gavin? And you want to say, oh, Gavin leaves for the park. But hang on, you'll be like, no, it's not he go to the park. It's he goes to park, right? And somehow we need a definite article here, so it should be he goes to the park. And Gavin did mention he will be going to 2 parks, so it should be he goes to the parks. Oh, by the time you figured out how to say it, you look up, trying to tell your friend the answer, he's already gone. He's already gone looking for Gavin because he can't be there waiting you all day long. So that's what happens in the real world, and that gives an idea how effective those consciously learned language is in your daily life. As we all learn languages the same way back in schools, through learning, the old approach, we all monitor ourselves all the time. And the more we monitor ourselves, the more we realize I'm just an idiot. Despite years of efforts, I still can't speak this bloody language properly, and that's when we start losing confidence. Meanwhile, our teachers still shoving down our throat those things like third person singular, things we're not ready to acquire. And they're wondering why it didn't work and scold us a lot, and that's when we get the pressure, we get more anxious. So now we're getting less confident and more anxious, and that's when the last hypothesis comes in, the affective filter.
Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us, is a language acquisition device. Our job is to get input into the device. So that's input here. Low motivation, low self-esteem, high anxiety, the block goes up, the filter goes up, and the input cannot get in. This explains how it can be that we can have two children in the same class, both getting comprehensible input. One makes progress, the other doesn't. One is open to the input, the other's closed.
Simply put, if we're not motivated, we're not confident, and we're very anxious, no matter how much comprehensible input we've got, we're not going to acquire anything. And there you go, those are the 5 key hypotheses in Dr. Krashen's theory. He put together his theory around 1975, 1976, so it's been around for nearly 5 decades. During which time, his theory has been evolving and has been supported by a wide body of research. And I've seen myself how it works on me and on many other polyglots, and that's why I've been a very passionate missionary of his theory for quite some time. Well, normally, when a person has just been brainwashed by me, he or she has lots of questions, which I think you must share, and that's why before any keyboard warriors jump on me, calling what I've just said, useless or a hoax, I like to start with some of the most frequently asked questions. Hopefully I can address some of your concerns. Now the first question, well actually it's not a question, it's some people's typical response to this theory. They simply don't believe it, saying that that can't be true. At best it might work for first language acquisition, a baby growing up, picking up his or her mother tongue, but definitely not for SLA. And let's hear what Dr. Krashen has to say on that.
The applications of the theory. It started with adult second language acquisition. Then, to my amazement, it worked for child second language every 3-4 years. Now I'm convinced it works for language acquisition in general. It laid the foundation for successful bilingual programs. And a couple of years ago, I started looking at research in animal language and wrote a paper on it, a couple of papers. And it fits fairly well. It's something that could guide the research.
So you can see, his theory has held up very well over the 5 decades and has been supported by an increasing number of research. Also, his theory could be applied in many other areas. Now the second question, or the second typical response, is that people say, okay, I'll take your word for it, but if that's true, do we need to learn grammar at all? That's a good question, isn't it? Let me give you some more backstory. Over the years, many researchers trying to find evidence for the traditional language teaching theory, the skill building hypothesis, ended up gathering more evidence for natural acquisition. They found out that even after substantial grammar study, even for the most motivated students, they show very modest gains in grammatical accuracy.
The readers were better. The second year of the project, this 9 disappeared. These groups were identical and even farther ahead of the audiolingual group. They were better in reading, they were better in writing, they were better on tests of grammar. In other words, the readers did better on grammar tests than children who studied grammar. This has been replicated again and again in the professional literature. This is simply one of many studies.
I think there's still a place for grammar. You see, if we acquire languages through comprehensible input, we learn the language the way native speakers do. But even for the most well-educated native speakers, they still have certain gaps, bits and pieces where their grammatical competence differ from the accepted use in that language. And that's when grammar should step in. If you have watched my last episode, I think you can recall when I was a boy, I always thought as if it was a single word. Well, I did recognize there were some different variations. You know, some people say as if it were, some people say as if it was. Sometimes it's as if she were or he were. But I had no idea what subjunctive was. I could use it, but it just never occurred to me as if could be two separate things. You see, that's when I need grammar. Personally, now I only use grammar as sort of a reference, like dictionaries, like these things. You don't spend all your time reading dictionary, do you? You just look up words in it when you run into troubles, and that's how you treat grammar. Dr. Krashen examined very carefully in his papers the value of grammar teaching, and I quote, "When we examine the impact of grammar study on grammar test performance, it is very modest." And therefore he concluded that, "I recommend delaying the teaching of these rules until more advanced levels. I would first give acquisition a chance, and then use conscious knowledge to fill in some of the gaps. There's no sense teaching rules for monitoring that will eventually be acquired." Grammar, thus, is not excluded. It is, however, no longer the star player, but has only a supporting role. Now, the third question is very similar. Now that we can acquire all languages on our own, is there still a place for teachers? Well, I think, now this is me thinking out loud here, this is not Dr. Krashen talking. For me, I think, of course teachers are still indispensable, but their role will have to change. You see, teachers are not supposed to be the ones who, teach us how to say this in English, how to say that in French. All these bits and pieces could be otherwise acquired by comprehensible input, so what do we need to hear it from you? Teachers should be responsible for providing students with lots of comprehensible input. Interesting books, movies, whatever it is that just might interest the students and is also comprehensible. On top of that, a teacher should be really good at making incomprehensible, complicated things comprehensible. Let's say if I want to study Italian, then people normally would say, then go to Italy. If I did go to Italy, I would understand nothing, because it would be just like noise, incomprehensible things for me. Pretty much like the video in Slovak I showed you at the very beginning. If instead I followed a good teacher who can make things really comprehensible, then I'd say I would make a lot more progress in my first lesson than I would have in my first year in Italy. So, what do I mean by a good teacher? So apart from making things comprehensible and providing students with lots of sources, I think a good teacher should make this thing very clear for his students. Your progress in the language does not come from anywhere else but comprehensible input. So you can't just sit here, doing nothing, waiting to be fed, thinking, okay, I'm going to learn a language this way. No, you have to be very proactive. Now, your progress does not come from grammar study, does not come from how much vocabulary you've got, doesn't even come from your output. Because research have shown to a large extent that output doesn't help very much. The contribution of conversation in your language study mainly comes from what the other person says to you, not so much what you say to them. So, a good teacher should never force speaking in his classroom, as that will only raise the affective filter among his students. And lastly, a good teacher should aim to bring the students up to a level where they are now autonomous acquirers, meaning their language proficiency is now at a reasonably good level where they can now access those authentic real-world material. That should be the true aim for any foreign language pedagogy. And the next question, where can I find those comprehensible inputs? Well, I think this is the most relevant one for you. And I'd like to see the answer to this question as the key takeaway for you today. So let's say if there's only one thing you can remember from my talk today, then it would be this. The short answer is, I don't know, because comprehensible input is highly customized. What works for me may not work for you, but I don't think you'll be very happy about that answer, so let me give you the long one. There's something called optimal input coined by Dr. Krashen. As his theory evolves till today, naturally there are some new terms, and this optimal input for me is what's most pleasant for both the teachers and students. There are 4 characteristics for this optimal input idea. First, of course, it has to be very comprehensible. But that doesn't mean it should be 100% transparent. Remember, I+1, it should be slightly above your current level. It may contain some unknown words, unknown grammatical items, but it's okay. As long as it doesn't impede your comprehension, then it's okay. The second characteristic is compelling. Compelling in the sense that it is so interesting that you temporarily forget it's in another language. If that's the case, then despite all those noise, you'll be drawn in to this story, to this content. You won't even notice those noise. The third characteristic for optimal input is that it must be rich in language that contributes to the message and the flow of the story. Now, the language included in the input also gives the reader support in understanding and therefore acquiring new aspects of the language. If you can do that, then it's not necessary to make sure that certain grammar or vocabulary are used, because rich input automatically includes new unacquired language at I+1 level. So let's say your teacher asks you a question in the classroom, like, what is this? Oh, it's a mouse. What is that? That's a deer. Well, as we use these props, so it's very comprehensible, but it's not rich in language. It involves very repetitive language pattern, and the language used contributes nothing to the whole story. That's what we want to avoid. And the last attribute for optimal input is quantity. It takes a great deal of comprehensible, compelling, rich input to achieve competence. Therefore, the optimal input must be abundant, which will provide more opportunities for acquisition of the new language. Many polyglots I know use series books as their optimal inputs. Say you're a big fan of Harry Potter, you've read books like these for thousands of times, and you've watched movies for thousands of times, then good. What I recommend you doing is start reading these books in your target language, English, Japanese, French, whatever it is. When you're reading them, what happens is that given you're so familiar with the story, you won't be looking at those linguistic features. You're just trying to enjoy the story. Because you're so familiar with the story, the whole context makes it even easier for you to understand things. So this book is now much more comprehensible for you. And this practice has been supported by many studies showing that better readers in English as first language tend to read more serious books. And a number of studies on second language acquisition also confirm this. So what are you waiting for? You can always start with these serious books or the graded readers available on the internet or in the bookstores. I hope you've enjoyed today's video so far. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank today's sponsor, Boya, for making this video possible. Actually, it's not my first time to use Boya's product. My previous videos were all shot using this VG330 package. What I like about this XM6 system though is that it comes with 2 lavalier microphones, meaning you can either choose his setup, using the built-in mic and clipping it on your shirt, or do what I do, using the lavalier connecting to your transmitter for better sound quality. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for watching today's video. I know, be like, oh god, another long video. Well, for me, it's very short. Because you see, this topic is the most important thing I've always wanted to cover in this channel. That's why I've been doing lots of research in the past few months. I have read dozens of Dr. Krashen's paper, I have watched almost all videos featuring him on the internet, and I've gathered a lot more empirical evidence just in case you don't believe me. Yes, I am fishing for Isensalien here for my efforts, but what I'm trying to tell you here is that today's video and last episode are the cornerstone for this channel, as they form the architecture of my woes of language acquisition. So going forward, when I make more specific content, when I say things like 自上而下 or comprehensible input, we'll be on the same page, hopefully. Now, again, thank you very much for your patience. Hopefully you've learned something. I'll see you next time.